Today we'll have 4 panelists. If you have questions for them during the course of the event, please post them through the chat and we will address them before the end of the virtual event. Our first panelist is Alexander Main. Alexander is the Director of International Policy at the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C. His areas of expertise include Latin America policy, the International Monetary Fund, and international economic issues. He's regularly interviewed by national and international media, and his analyses have been published in a variety of outlets, including the New York Times, Foreign Policy, the Los Angeles Times, The Hill, and the Monde Diplomat. Alex holds a degree in history and political science from Sorbonne University in Paris, France. Alex, thank you for taking the time to talk to us. Can you please explain to us what are standard drawing rights, and just tell us a little more about what this means for us?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Melvin. First of all, thanks very much, Melvin and Brandon and the team at the World Trade Center in Arkansas for hosting this webinar. And it's wonderful to connect with some of the good people of Arkansas here today, and of course, people from elsewhere, perhaps around the world. So at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, you can call us CEPR, we look at economic policy, what has good results, what has less good results in the US and around the world. We've spent a long time monitoring the work of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which is based here in Washington, D.C., and I'm in Washington, D.C., in case that's not apparent. But even though it's based here in DC, it's mostly involved in shaping economic policy in the developing world. And at CEPR, we've been quite critical of the policies of the IMF in the past, but today we're going to talk to you about something the IMF does that we believe can have an enormous positive impact for economies around the world, including the US economy. So I don't think it's news to any of you that the world is currently experiencing some serious economic pain at the moment. The economic fallout of the pandemic is plain to see in our own country, with social distancing measures leading to record high unemployment, enormous revenue loss for major sectors of the economy, and so on. And the economic crisis that the world is experiencing today is similar to the crisis generated by the global financial meltdown in 2008, 2009, but it's even worse in its effects in the US and globally. And let's just consider the numbers. Whereas in 2009, global economic growth, GDP growth, gross domestic product growth, fell to negative 0.01%, according to the IMF data. For this year, economic growth in 2020 is down nearly 4.5%, according to IMF projections. And some regions are seeing much sharper downturns. For instance, Latin America, where economic growth is expected to fall nearly 9%. And that's the worst. Those are the worst numbers since the Great Depression of the 1930s. So these numbers could even end up being worse, given the dire impact that the latest wave of COVID infections is having around the world, with many countries, again, mandating strict social distancing measures and the partial or total shutdown of many businesses. So how are countries dealing with this? So wealthy countries, which tend to have strong, stable currencies, have been able to pump more than $5 trillion into their economies through major public spending measures and quantitative easing, carried out by central banks. And these measures have helped mitigate the economic pain significantly in wealthy countries. But what about the rest of the world? They don't have the same tools that advanced economies have. In addition, they're facing major capital flight, many of them, that is, money from private investors that's flowing out of their economies. And they're having a lot of trouble on the whole borrowing money due to the lack of liquidity in financial markets and very high interest rates. So what can they do? and how can the global economy recover given this situation? So this is where the IMF's SDRs, special drawing rights, come in. So special drawing rights are assets that are convertible to major international currencies, to dollars, pounds, euros, yen, etc. And SDRs are produced without any sort of monetary contribution from the US. So they cost the US taxpayer nothing. For SDRs to be produced, a large majority, 85% of IMF members need to agree to an allocation of a certain amount of SDRs. The IMF then is tasked with distributing this allocation to countries in amounts that are proportional to each country's quota share at the IMF, which is roughly proportional to the size of a country's economy. So as a result, the majority of SDRs go to wealthier countries, and around a third go to developing countries in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. But depending on the size of the allocation, SDRs can still provide very critical financial support to poorer countries. So the IMF acts essentially like a global central bank, like a global Federal Reserve, issuing money to the national central banks in each country. And countries can either leave most or all of the money in their central banks as international reserves, which is what wealthy countries tend to do with their SDRs, or they can exchange them for hard currency and use that currency to purchase imports or to pay off debt, or in some cases, inject the money into the local economies. And I'm just going to point out to you all a chart that we have. So here I need to do the screen sharing function. Let's see if I can manage this. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. This is the first time I've actually done this. Can you see? Hold on. First I have to have the right screen. Okay, here we go. So this is from a great website that tells you everything you need to know about SDRs. And there's a chart on this website which shows you how much.
I'm sorry, we're not seeing.
You're not seeing it?
Seeing it now. Brandon, can you help us make sure that that he can share the screen, please?
Alex, I'm also happy to share the chart if it's
okay. Well, if it works better from Isaac's computer, then let's do that. I'll give it one more shot here to see if we can do it. Is it coming up now?
There we go.
Yes.
Okay. Can you see it? Okay. And hopefully the size of the characters isn't too small and people can make out what's on here. But it's a chart that shows you how much individual countries would receive if the IMF were to issue 2 trillion SDRs. And 2 trillion SDRs is about $2.75 trillion worth of SDRs. And why 2 trillion SDRs? Well, that's a proposal that's on the table that I think Isaac is going to tell you a little bit more about later on. But if the IMF were to allocate that many SDRs, you can see here what countries would receive. So for instance, Argentina, which is, by the way, suffering a major debt crisis at the moment and really needs financial support, they would be receiving, and this is in millions of dollars, so they would be receiving over $18 billion worth of SDRs, close to $19 billion worth of SDRs. So obviously that would be very helpful. Then we can look at an African country, a small African country like Benin would receive $837 million worth of SDRs, which is very big in the context of that small economy. Central African Republic, $558 million worth of SDRs. Colombia would be receiving $12 billion worth of SDRs, and so on. Anyway, so this is, just to point it all to you, this is from a website that you can find called globalcovidresponse.org, and it's among the resources. So I invite you all to have a look at that, and there's a lot of great material on SDRs in there. So let me just stop sharing my screen. That's all right. Okay, stop sharing. Did that stop?
Yes.
Okay, thanks for bearing with me. This is sort of new to me. But anyway, so this, shows you what countries would receive, and it would come at a time when this sort of financial support could be extremely beneficial to these countries. It's really critical, actually, for a lot of these countries to, make it through the pandemic economically. And today, countries in the developing world are really facing a dire predicament. There are plenty of statistics out there, but I'll just point to a couple of things that give you a sense of this. The head of the World Food Program, and as you may know, they just got the Nobel Peace Prize, the World Food Program, for helping mitigate hunger around the world. The head of that program just the other day predicted that we're going to have famines of biblical proportions in 2021. And that organization predicts that around 270 million people are going to be facing crisis levels of hunger next year as a result of the economic fallout of the pandemic. IMF, so getting back to the IMF, the researchers there, who are not known for being overdramatic, they consider, and this is in the last World Economic Outlook that they published, that the pandemic will actually reverse the progress made since the 1990s in reducing global poverty. So major backtracking, really, for the developing world. And this dire situation in developing countries spills over into wealthier economies. And as an example of that, US exports, for instance, they have been down significantly due in large part to a sharp reduction in global demand. Trade is way down. And it has a lot to do with the economic fallout of the pandemic, the lack of liquidity, of financial liquidity. And there is a major need for exports in these poor countries. There's a dire need for, basic essentials, food, medical equipment, medicine, and so on, but they don't have the liquidity. They don't have the cash to continue purchasing them. So what can be done? Special drawing rights. The last time there was an allocation of special drawing rights was during the 2008-2009 global financial crisis, when IMF country members agreed on a $250 billion SDR allocation. This time, today, the need is much greater. And so that's why we're seeing legislation in the US Congress that Isaac will be discussing, probably Don as well, calling for 2 trillion SDRs, which again is around $2.75 trillion worth of SDRs. And that may seem like a lot, but compare that amount to the $5 trillion that I mentioned earlier that wealthy countries have already pumped into their economies. And take into consideration that only around 31% of the allocation will be going to middle and low income countries. I'm leaving out China because China is kind of an outlier. It has massive foreign reserves. It's able to take care of itself. But that leaves 148 middle and low income countries that would be receiving, with a 2 trillion SDR issuance, around $842 billion worth of SDRs. Again, compare that to what wealthy countries have been able to supply themselves with the $5 trillion sort of stimulus measures. 148 countries, and that represents a little more than 5 billion people. So when you put in that context, 2 trillion SDRs is really not all that much. And again, this can be done without costing the the United States, anything. And we argue at CEPR, and economists from around the world have been arguing that this is a no-brainer. It's good for the world, and it's good for the US. So hopefully, somewhere in there, I've answered Melvin's question from earlier. Thank you.
So Alex, it seems like this does not have any cost to U.S. taxpayers, and it seems like then it would provide with countries, in the case of Arkansas, for example, where we traditionally export agricultural commodities. They would provide it would provide funding for those countries to actually buy agricultural items, correct? Does that make
Absolutely. And again, a lot of countries that are facing dire lack of food. Again, the World Food Program predicting that 270 million people next year are going to be facing dire hunger. They need this food, and they need the foreign exchange that they can get from SDRs in order to purchase these agricultural products. So here in the US and in Arkansas, there is plenty of food to sell to the world. What the rest of the world needs is the capacity in developing countries. Again, they don't have it, but with SDRs, they would have increased, greatly increased financial capacity to be able to buy these essential goods to feed their people.
Okay, so and that's a good segue for which is Katie's story. Katie joined Integrity Grain in 2017, having grown up on a farm. Her love for the land and what it produces runs deep. Katie graduated from Arkansas State University with Bachelor's of Science in Agriculture. She cares deeply about agriculture and farmers, and she respects and loves the land that farmers have. Integrity Grain is comprised of a group of hardworking, down-to-earth farmers forging powerful partnerships with buyers around the world. They offer long grain rice, yellow corn, and yellow soybeans. Their proximity to the Mississippi River makes shipping by barge easy. They also have rail and containers capabilities. So with that, I am going to leave you a little bit with Katie so she can explain it from an agriculture and farmer's perspective, what what she does, and then from her explanation, then we'll kind of understand better how then the United States can benefit from SDRs. Katie, thank you.
Thank you so much. This is my first video call, so I'm a newbie. Y'all hang with me. I'm hoping nothing crashes in my house or anything like that. Again, I'm Katie Story. I'm with Integrity Grain. We are in Arkansas, and I'm here to just kind of tell you guys a little bit about what we do and maybe our goal at Integrity Grain, and then I'm going to let them sell the SDRs on the other stuff. We've I don't know if that's perfect. It sounds really great. But I just want to more explain what we do and some challenges that we have faced in exporting so that we can all see how this would work. Anyway, like say, I work for a group of farmers. We are not owned by any type of conglomerate. These are men who are literal boots on the ground. And we grow soybeans, yellow corn, and long grain rough rice. Rice, of course, is probably where we see in the future our exporting getting larger. We are very aware of the large grain companies in the United States, and that is not what we want to be. We are just a small group right here in the Delta. We just want to take care of ourselves, but we do want to find that market in the export world where we can, get these business relationships built and do some exporting. In the grand scheme of the United States, I think you would go, girl, you do not have enough grain to, supply some larger countries. So, and we do not. But we would love to just use what we have around here and the storage capabilities that we have around here, and see if we can find a market. We did actually. Integrity Grain sent the first shipment of long grain rough rice to the Ivory Coast of Africa last July. That has been sent there in 17 years. And I'm still sticky from jumping through all the tape, but we got it. We did it. It was a good deal on both sides. They were so happy with the quality of the grain, and I won't go into that with you guys because probably just not what this is all about. But just how they were so happy. So we have gone there. We of course would love to go other places. We just want to find the right fit, and we want to find the right fit for us. We want to find the right fit for our buyer. So many times you get so far, and this is probably the punchline of my entire presentation here, but you get so far. Do you have what I want? Yes. Can you get it to me? Yes. Can you get it to me in this amount of time? Yes. And then the whole deal falls apart, of course, when you start talking financing. You get into situations where, okay, well, good, you send that today and I'm going to pay you in 12 months, or you send that today and I'm going to pay you in 18 months. And so anyway, that is probably our number one struggle is this. But with us having rice, I just feel like it's such a big deal that that it would help us if we could go forward with some help. So anyway, have I covered everything that you guys would like me to cover?
Absolutely. The company that purchased your rice from Cote d'Ivoire, right now, are you trying to sell but are having issues financing, meaning that they cannot pay for it?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. If you could see today, of course, our communication is wonderful with them. We are just bottom line, we're down to they need it. Not to go too in depth of what they've got going on, but they have set up meals to try to be self-sustainable there and all these things, and they can't grow enough rice to even run their mills, which is perfect. I'm not a rice miller. We are just coming straight out of the field and going over there. So they actually, it's good for them. It would even stimulate their economy to be able to fill those mills with our long grain rough rice. Hasn't been milled yet. But then you just get into it's just money. And then you start even on our US side of things, going into lines of credit and things like that. And then you get into an African bank. Is a US bank going to take that African bank's line of credit? So, I mean, I know we have options, and we're looking at several of those, but it's definitely our stopping point right now.
Okay. Well, and that's then another good segue then for Don to then talk to us a little bit about his experience. And I know that in Iowa he's done some efforts. So Don, can you talk to us a little bit about what your experience has been? And you're muted right now, Don.
Don, at the bottom of your screen, you might see a little microphone image that you could click on.
Next to the camera. Camera image.
Melvin, if it's helpful, I'm happy to share my slides while Don gets that figured out.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. So Isaac, I will let you then go ahead and talk. I'm just going to briefly introduce you. Isaac leads Action Corps, a grassroots humanitarian organization that grew out of Oxfam, America. We trained organizers in 10 states and counting. Isaac played a role in passage of the Yemen War Powers Resolution last year. Currently, he has coordinated a network of over 100 U.S. faith-based humanitarian and trade organizations advocating for global COVID response through the IMF. He played a key role in the passage in the U.S. House authorizing provisions this fall, which is what we are talking about. So this has passed through House. Isaac holds a master's in public administration from the City University of New York with a concentration in nonprofit management. He's a certified professional in healthcare quality and a qualified Spanish interpreter. With that, I will leave you with Isaac.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it. I'm going to share a few slides here. And what I wanted to show you, first of all, here's the website that Alex shared earlier, which is a great resource and includes in here an issue brief that he and colleagues wrote, which an excellent resource for follow-up. But here are a few slides that I put together that I'll share with you. So in this picture, you see a man who I presume is in Nigeria with a bag of what I believe is rice for people in Nigeria. When we hear about COVID-19, I know that my family has been affected by COVID-19, and I imagine your family has been affected by COVID-19. And you know, it's killed so many people in this country, in the United States. But around the world, the main source of death from COVID isn't actually the COVID itself, but it's the economic crisis and the impact on the healthcare system. And so you've heard these, you know, incredibly large numbers of people that are expected to die this year. And it doesn't have to be that way. And all of you can play a role in helping change the course of history for millions of people around the world. And I know that may seem hard to believe, but having worked on this legislation, we were able to get this passed by the House of Representatives twice this year. Once this summer, and then once again this fall as part of the HEROES bill. And we know that we can do this. We just need people like yourselves to stand up. And if you work in the Senate office, for you talking with your senator, if you are a constituent of a senator, and most of you probably are, reaching out to that office, and you can use that website to take action. Here are just, you know, you've heard a lot of facts about special drawing rights, but here are just some plain language words that you can use when you're talking about this solution. We know that millions of people are going to starve to death and die as a result of COVID and these economic problems without action. But these emergency financial resources from the IMF, these international resources that won't cost US taxpayers a penny, can help countries save lives. And I believe that we have a responsibility to our fellow human beings around the world, especially when there's something that we could do that wouldn't cost us. There's really no good reason for the world not to release these special drawing rights. And I think that's part of the reason why we've amassed a broad coalition of supporters from the Presbyterian Church USA to the United Methodist, the Union for Reform Judaism, several Catholic organizations. I saw the executive director of the Maryknoll Office for Global Concern is on. We have the Iowa Farmers Union, the International Chamber of Commerce has supported a major issuance of special drawing rights. We have Democrats, and we also have Republicans who have weighed in and said something that we want to see move forward. And you can email your lawmaker using that website and going to the Take Action page. This is Action Corps, a picture of us advocating. And just regular people around the United States, no special qualifications other than we care about people around the world. I want to show you this place where you can take action on our website. You could go to globalcovidresponse.org right now if you're probably in front of a computer, and you can write to your member of Congress using the template there. And you can also download a one-pager that has information, and you could share that with decision makers that you know and other people, community leaders, people who are influential. I'm going to stop my screen share for a moment here. And Melvin, if you know how to stop it faster than I do. Oh, I guess I figured it out. All right. So I want to talk about the why now matters. we heard this legislation passed the House. It's now sitting in a committee in the Senate, and that committee is chaired by Senator Risch of Idaho. So he needs to hear from people that around the country that this is important, that we want to make sure that we do our part in addressing the global fallout from COVID. And also we want to reach out to Senator Inhofe, who's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's next door to Arkansas over in Oklahoma. And Senator Inhofe, if either of these senators, Senator Risch or Senator Inhofe, if they were to decide that this must go forward, they could make it happen. And they could make it happen this week. And this week is particularly critical because we have this unique opportunity with must-pass legislation that has to go through Congress. It goes through Congress every year, and we could get this included. Senator Boozman from Arkansas also could play a significant role. He's the co-chair of the Senate Hunger Caucus. We know this is something that he cares about, and he could play an important role in helping making sure that millions of people don't have to starve to death. I grew up hearing that whole refrain about, finish your vegetables because of people starving around the world. And, finishing your vegetables is not going to prevent people from starving, but passing this legislation would do that. But I thank you for your time, and I ask for your action.
Well, thank you, Isaac. So I don't know if Don is able to unmute himself now. He should be able to. If not, Don, you might want to, if you want to leave and then come back in. Brandon will try to admit you and see if that will fix the muting. So it seems like these special drawing rights are in some way a type of money, of bond that countries would get. So they would receive money. And Don, are you able to? I still cannot hear you. So this is it's something that then countries are going to be able to have funds to then buy essential, in this case, food, which I'm assuming that if a country has funding and it's an emerging country, the first thing that they're going to do is they're going to try to buy food. So in the case of Cote d'Ivoire, for example, we were talking with Katie and how she's ready to ship rice to them, but they're just unable to pay for it right now. So the point given is, if these special drawing rights were to pass, which it seems like it needs Senate approval. It has been approved by the House, but it needs Senate approval. Okay. It does not cost anything to the U.S. taxpayer.
Correct.
Is that correct? Okay. So it seems like then in the case of Arkansas, then the benefit would be that not only would be able to export agricultural foods like rice, for example, and a farmer like Katie will be able to export rice, but then we'll be able to feed then a country during the COVID-19 crisis. So it seems like a couple of things are important during the special drawing rights. Now, what happens once this goes through the Senate? What's the next step?
Shall I take this question? After it goes through the Senate, it gets signed into the law by the president. And then the IMF, then the US is required to use its voice and vote to approve a $2 trillion SDR issuance. And the managing director of the IMF this past spring on multiple occasions expressed her support for this initiative. The heads of state of various G20 countries and African countries and Latin American countries have said this is something that they want and that they need. This is something with broad support. Right now, the only holdup is really in the US Treasury. And the US has veto power at the IMF. And only Congress can authorize an SDR issuance, this emergency financial resource from the IMF, at the size and scale needed. Only Congress can authorize that. And so we are really close, and we just need that little extra push with Senator Risch and Senator Inhofe and Senator Boozman. We know could make a big difference. As honestly, all of the senators, those are just three that have particular power in this situation. And I saw there was a question about, what are the objections and why isn't this passing? I think one of the biggest challenges is that people just haven't known about this. I've been doing international solidarity development work for over 10 years, and I never heard of an SDR. And in fact, the first time it was explained to me, I had to, after an hour-long conversation about it with an economist, I had to call up a friend and say, what's he talking about? So thank you, all of you, for your learning about this, because that's a really key step. But I think part of what we've heard from Treasury is a concern about the fact that these are untargeted, that they would go to all 189 members of the International Monetary Fund. And the concern that they've expressed, which frankly doesn't make a lot of sense to me, is that, well, wealthy countries that don't need this resource would get some of it. But the thing is that it's not going to hurt any wealthy countries. It's not going to hurt poor countries that a wealthy country get this resource. For a country like the United States, which this past spring created trillions of dollars, the Fed created trillions of dollars to help keep the economy afloat. This is essentially doing that for the global economy. And for countries like the US, it will go on an accounting sheet, and the US won't really particularly use those SDRs. But for poor countries, that's going to represent a significant portion of their GDP, of the assets that they have, and can be a lifeline and help save millions of lives, as well as increasing the capacity to import goods from the United States and other countries.
Okay, and I think that we have one question from Joel Clark. He's saying there's no effect on the U.S. So I'm guessing that the question probably is that it does not cost anything or have any financial impact on the U.S. Alex or Isaac, can you answer that question?
Yeah, that's correct. It doesn't cost the U.S. anything. So, essentially, it's just a decision that's taken by IMF members. As Isaac mentioned, the U.S. has veto power over this decision. Otherwise, it seems very probable that it would have been taken already, that this measure would have already been put into place, just as it was back in 2009. But additionally, there is a small legislative obstacle on the U.S. side. The U.S. is the one country that requires its Congress to approve an amount of SDRs that surpasses a certain threshold. And so today, most economists are saying that, in fact, the financing needs of countries are so great that the amount of SDRs that needs to be issued needs to surpass that threshold. And that's why there's this legislation that Isaac was mentioning that's been going through Congress, that's been passed by the House of Representatives, that's still being considered in the Senate. And, sort of the additional evidence that it costs nothing is that you have the Congressional Budget Office, which is the entity which estimates the amount that any piece of legislation is going to cost U.S. taxpayers. Their estimate is that the cost of the 2 trillion SDR issuance is zero, literally zero. That's what they said. So that's sort of additional confirmation of that fact. And again, I think in response a bit to the earlier question as well, the SDRs can be used in two ways, and generally they're used just to increase the amount of international reserves that a country has. And this allows the country to use some of their cash reserves that they already have for other things, to spend internally, to buy imports, etc. It frees up some money to have these additional assets. So a lot of countries just leave those assets sitting in their central bank. But when they're in a really dire situation, and a lot of countries are today, then they can convert those assets, and the IMF actually does this for them. The IMF administers the transaction where the SDRs are exchanged for a hard currency, generally dollars. But the SDRs are worth, their value comes from a basket of currencies, a certain proportion of dollars, a certain proportion of pounds, a certain proportion of euros, etc. That's what an SDR is worth. And so when a country wants to trade it in for cash, there is an exchange rate to any of these currencies. At the moment, it's $1.36 per SDR. And so countries can make that exchange. They then pay, and this is a point that's sometimes been raised, they pay a very, very small amount of interest on the SDRs once they've exchanged them for cash. It is a tiny amount of interest. At the moment, it is 0.123%. That's about the lowest interest rate you could find for a loan anywhere. And so it really doesn't add significantly to any country's debt. It's a very insignificant amount, which makes this particularly useful for countries that already have high levels of debt. They can trade in these SDRs for cash. They can put that cash into the economy. Generally, though, the cash goes directly to paying for foreign imports. Like I said, food, and food from Arkansas, that long grain rice that Katie was telling us about earlier.
And that's a good point, because we have two questions that one of them has to do with that. First question is, could a wealthy country tell the IMF that they don't want to share, or that they don't want their share, and that the IMF can redistribute that money to poorer countries that need it? So that's the first question. The second question is, so if Ivory Coast received an SDR allocation, how would they use that to pay, in this case, Katie's farming company for the rice? Would the IMF send money to Integrity Grain, to Katie? Where would those funds come from ultimately? So two questions, and feel free, Alex or Isaac, to respond. Don, I don't know if you are unmuted, but from our end you are. So if you are, please welcome to answer.
Sure. Should I do that, or Isaac? I don't want to monopolize the mic here. But yeah, so the first question, can a wealthy country transfer their SDRs? Absolutely, they can. And that proposal is also on the table. Given the fact that wealthy countries get a big proportion, as I was saying earlier, and that they don't actually use them, then they could put them to use by either transferring them to countries. And there's discussion around creating sort of a common fund that can be used for the countries that most need the SDRs, transferring to those countries. These SDRs can also be transferred to a number of multilateral institutions, including the World Food Program, which at the moment really needs extra funding to deal with the that we earlier. So that's absolutely a possibility. But I think where we need to be careful is in considering that would be sufficient for wealthy countries merely to transfer their SDRs. At the moment, the pool of SDRs is there's a little over 200 billion SDRs out there that can be transferred. A lot of those, again, are in the hands of wealthy countries. That's not enough to deal with the current situation. The situation is, again, much worse than what we saw in 2009, when there was a $250 billion issuance of SDRs. So the transfer, while that is a positive thing and can be a helpful thing, most economists that look at the issue of SDRs would tell you that's no. But still, it's something definitely that should be considered so that those SDRs can be put to good use. And on the question of the Ivory Coast and what they would do with their, how they would be able to pay Katie's company, I mean, it's really quite simple. They would be able to receive the foreign exchange they need. And Ivory Coast is a country that's had a lot of difficulties. The civil war there contributed to them, that has made it very hard to borrow money, to have credit lines, and so on. SDRs would automatically provide them with a source of hard cash. They could transfer those SDRs that they receive, and the cash would be on hand. When the transfer, actually the exchange of SDRs for dollars occurs, I believe those funds actually sit in New York, where a lot of the international banking system is based, at the disposal of countries. And so that makes it all the easier to, from a bank in New York, it's much easier to pay for Katie's wonderful long grain rice than from, a small bank that doesn't have strong, credit ratings and so on, in Ivory Coast. So yeah, hopefully that answers that question as well.
Okay. Do we have any more questions? I know that certainly SDRs. This is something that it's been around for a while, but the public in general, we do not hear about it much. I guess because it's only used in critical situations, and it's not something that's issued all the time. But any other questions? Please, you can post them on the chat, and we can address them.
I saw your polling questions and the little quiz in the chat as well, and it's good to see some people answering those questions.
Yes, in the chat we have Brandon has some interesting polling questions, and okay, so why it seems like there's two more questions. It says SDR, basically the reserve money they have deposited with IMF. That means it's their money and not supposed to have interest. I agree with Miriam. Is that?
So there's no actual money at the IMF. The SDRs are produced by the IMF. They can then be exchanged for a major international currency like the dollar, but those dollars are supplied by the country that produces that currency. So dollars would be supplied by the U.S. and by the U.S. Treasury. Euros would be supplied by the European Central Bank. So each of those countries actually provides the cash. But this is essentially money that's not part of the budgets of these countries. This is money that's printed and then transferred to these countries. It's not something that is deducted from the current expenses of any of these countries. And so again, there's a tiny amount of interest when you exchange your SDRs for cash. It used to be a higher rate of interest, and so it was more prohibitive. So, 20 years ago, it was more like a 4% rate of interest. Today, again, it is an absolutely minuscule amount, 0.123%. And that, makes it much more sustainable for countries to exchange their SDRs. They may later buy back the SDRs. They can do that, and then they stop paying the interest. But in many cases, the interest is so low that it really contributes minimally to their debt burden. So there's no major urgency for them to buy back their SDRs.
So these last 4 minutes that we have, there are a few more questions. First, why doesn't the IMF sell off its gold in an effort to raise capital and at least to float a gold-backed bond? That's one question. And then the other question is, have all other member countries of the IMF approved this SDR legislation, leaving only the US?
It sounds like we have Don.
Yeah, it would be nice. It'd be nice to hear Don. I can respond in 5 seconds to each. The first one, I don't know the answer to. I don't know if anyone else does. So this is not an issue I've looked into specifically. So I'm not going to venture a guess on why the IMF doesn't sell off its gold reserves. And then the second question. Have all the member countries of the IMF approved this SDR legislation, leaving only the US? We don't know who's approved because it hasn't gone to a vote. It hasn't gone to a vote because the US has not shown that it will approve, and that means that it won't pass. The US has a 16% voting share. The decision in order to pass has to be by 85%, so therefore the US is needed. But what we have heard is that there's only one other country that at one point objected to SDRs. We're not aware of the reasons, but that is the country of India. All other countries that we're aware of have supported it, again, apart from the US, and have even made sort of public statements to that effect, including African countries, European countries, Latin American countries, and so on. And it'd be great to hear Don, since we have.
Don, you're now.
Jumping in late here, I don't know what happened. It just said that I had been muted by somebody. I think it was Bill Gates, but anyway.
Probably.
Yeah.
So essentially, from a farmer's perspective, I mean, there's three components to this. Number one is, of course, preventing the starvation of millions of people. I mean, farmers are people. We all care about what happens in the world, and despite our own self-interest of wanting to grow food and export it, it would be great to save lives and also to not have a global economic meltdown, because when that happens, it obviously has a direct impact on United States exports. Currently, the United States exports about $137 billion in agricultural products. Depending on who you talk to, the majority of that should come from family farms. Now, large pork producers are considered family farms. But when you look at a specific country like Chile, I mean, essentially it's $107 million a year that they would not be able to buy, although they're a very developed country. So in the macro sense, a global economy is good for Iowa farmers. It's good for Midwestern farmers. And also it's essential for people around the world to import food. And the other thing too is it segues into the United States exporting more types of food and different varieties to countries instead of just grains and tractors. That's kind of the economic punchline from a farmer's perspective on this. And thank you for letting me jump in at the end.
We're happy that you were able to join. Okay, so it seems like once the U.S. signals that it wants to move forward, then it would then go into a vote at the IMF the IMF level, and the only other country that has signaled any any reservation has been India, but we don't know yet exactly the reasoning for that. Okay.
Right. That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay. All right. So we I know that we've run out of time. Isaac has sent some chats on his information, contact information, on any questions, any additional questions that you may have. So if you do have any additional questions, please feel free to contact Isaac and at that email that he just sent through the chat. And I think that now that we understand a little bit better what SDRs are and that they exist, and that there is an effort to do a drawing now through the pandemic. It makes sense that it happened during 2019. I'm sorry, during 2009, and the economic downturn that we had back then. It makes sense that again we were looking at issuing them again during the pandemic. So I do know that there are countries that are having a very, very difficult economic situation. The United States, we are struggling, of course, ourselves to try to get out of the economic turbulences of COVID-19. So I can only imagine countries that are developing or that are just really struggling even before the pandemic. I can only imagine right now how they could how they're doing. So it seems like this is something that it's a good discussion. It certainly looks like it's something positive from an Arkansas perspective and a U.S. perspective. When we have our largest export by volume is agriculture. It certainly makes sense that that we look at something like this to, like I said previously, export, and also for the humanitarian purpose of being able to feed then countries that need the food. So it seems like that would be all. If anyone has any last thoughts, we'll leave those here. And Isaac, Alex.
I saw that there was a question in the chat about if accessing this recording afterwards.
Yeah, a good question. Brandon has been kind enough to record this, and if you registered for this, you're going to receive a link to the recording. If not, you can certainly email us, and we're going to actually upload it in the World Trade Center YouTube channel. So Brandon just confirmed that. If contact us at any time, I'm going to put my email here. So in case that someone needs any assistance with recording or accessing the recording, they can email me and get the recording. So thank you very much, Isaac, Alex, Dawn, Katie. Thank you so much for your time, for taking time and explaining to us what this this SDR drawing rights issuance is all about, and for answering the questions that we had. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.